Hello and welcome to the last section of chapter 36. We're doing the Cold War begins. Today we're looking at democratic divisions in 1948 through military seesaw in Korea. So let's get to it. President Truman up for election in 1948, not re-election because he was appointed after the death of Franklin Roosevelt. The Republicans wanting to win back the White House for the first time since 1932. Well, they hadn't had a president since 1933, since Hoover left. Nominate Thomas E. Dewey, pictured here, who, wow, he looks like Howard Stark, almost like Tony Stark's dad. He got the pencil-thin mustache, and all the experts, all the polls showed he was going to win. Truman was nominated because Dwight D. Eisenhower refused to run in 1948. The Democrats asked him instead of this, the acting sitting president who was appointed from the vice presidency. But Truman runs. And then the Southerners kind of upset. They have their own party, the Dixiecrats. And they nominate Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond was the senator for South Carolina all the way until like 2003. He served until he was 100 and something years old. Just crazy. The Progressives nominate Henry Wallace, the guy that was the former vice president for Roosevelt that was pushed out for being a little too eccentric, a little too crazy, a little too liberal. So, like I said, all the pundits, all the polls predicted that Dewey was going to win, that Truman didn't have a shot. And so Truman went on this whistle-stop tour across the nation, this tireless, just, train stop after train stop, campaigning directly to the American people. And still, even on election night, all the experts predicted that Dewey was going to win. This was the end of President Truman. Truman actually went to Grand Junction in 1948 for Colorado history. He won in a stunning upset after his vigorous campaign, and it really shocked Americans that this happened, which was remarkable because, the Democrats were divided. You had one Republican candidate in Dewey versus three Democratic candidates. Truman, the Dixiecrats, Strom Thurmond largely takes, the Southern vote, and then the Progressives, usually when you have the division, that's going to basically allow the other party to win. Truman had his own programs. He wanted to start the Fair Deal. This is on the heels of the New Deal, but with a Republican-controlled Congress, it wasn't going to happen. It was largely ignored. It was left unpassed for being too expensive, too broad, and Truman never really does a lot domestically in terms of changing America. Doesn't do a lot of it. He does pass the Housing Act of 1949, and the Social Security Act of 1950, which were steps towards helping people with pension and retirement, unemployment, and getting easier, cheaper houses. This is the very famous Dewey defeats Truman, Chicago Tribune. I mean, even at the very end, the 12th hour, the newspapers were predicting Dewey was going to win. The quote here, "That ain't the way I heard it," from Truman, and him holding up the paper showing that he lost when he gleefully won and defeated George Dewey. You can see that the electoral map's kind of over the place. The red went to Truman. The blue was for Dewey. And then states' rights, Strom Thurmond won a couple states here. Progressive, Wallace, he didn't do very well, but, it's still a stunning, remarkable turn of events. So in his second term, Truman, who's been labeled soft on communism, has the first real threat of the Cold War, which is Korea. Korea was under Japanese control until 1945. 3 days before the bombing of Hiroshima, the Soviet Union finally joined the Pacific War. And in that time, just had enough time to invade and take North Korea. When the dust settles at the end of the war, after victory over Japan Day and the formal surrender on September 2nd, basically Korea was divided. The United States occupied South Korea. The North Koreans were occupied with the Soviet Unions. And so they divided the country in half at the 38th parallel. Both countries made governments in their own image, and so South Korea becomes a democratic capitalist nation. North Korea becomes a communist, dictatorship of sorts. And so the Soviets are in control of the North, the Americans are in the South. They could not agree how to unite the two. They couldn't figure it out. And so both sides pull out their forces in 1949. Basically said, all right, you guys just handle it yourself. The United States actually disarmed South Korea for fear that they were going to invade North Korea. The opposite happens. On June 25th, 1950, North Korea invades South Korea, trying to unite Korea under a communist nation. Now, under the Truman Doctrine, the United States is supposed to aid any country resisting communism, South Korea being number one now on that list. So the National Security Council Memorandum number 68, NSC 68, called for the quadrupling military spending and using containment policy in regards to the Soviet Union. This was a key document in the Cold War because it marked a major step towards the militarization of the United States' foreign policy. So Truman, North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel. They captured the capital city of Seoul, so South Korea doesn't have a Seoul anymore. Truman immediately sends air and sea forces to help. The United States, who was occupying Japan, had lots of forces there. Not a tremendous amount to fight a war, but enough there to take action. He thought the Soviet Union was behind this, that this was them trying to spread communism throughout the world, and he called it a police action. This was not a war. The United States does not declare war. It's a police action, and so that becomes this new kind of norm in the Cold War, where the United States uses its military not in an official war, but in police actions or engagements. The UN, the United Nations, condemned the invasion. It sent troops. They were all under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, the hero from World War II, from the Pacific War. Now, this is a coalition of forces. There's dozens of countries involved in this war. The American and UN ground forces landed on June 30th. And so 5 days after the initial invasion of North Korea, there's UN and American forces on the ground fighting in South Korea. It's a very swift action that they repulsed or tried to repulse the North Korean invasion. The goal of the United Nations was simply to push the North Koreans out of South Korea back across the 38th parallel. So their goal was to liberate South Korea. If you look at this photograph, it's interesting. If you look, there's African-American gentlemen and white Americans in this picture. Truman, one of the things he did in 1947 was he integrated the military. It was a big step towards civil rights. And so Korea is the first war since the American Revolution that you have mixed race divisions in the United States. Some good videos on Korea. So early on, the Americans, the United Nations forces, and the South Koreans are overwhelmed. There's just too many North Koreans. There's not enough troops there. And they only controlled the southern tip of Pusan of the Korean Peninsula by September 1950. It's from there that Douglas MacArthur launches a massive counterattack much further north at Incheon. This was an amphibious invasion. It was actually two invasions and separated by 12 hours. Incheon has some of the highest and lowest tides in the world in terms of the water level dropping and rising. And so they had two invasion forces. The first invasion force came ashore, established a beachhead, pushed their way in, and then they had to wait for reinforcements 12 hours later. It's intricately planned. It's actually a little more complicated in terms of the moving parts than D-Day. It's not as big in terms of numbers, but it is a brilliantly planned invasion. It catches the communists off guard. The American forces recapture the city of Seoul. And then you have troops also launching a counterattack from Pusan and pushing north. And so by October, the communists were back across the 38th parallel. And so the war should be over. The United Nations goal of liberating South Korea was done. These are photographs from the Incheon invasion. And it's at this point that MacArthur and the United States get a little greedy. Instead of just calling it good and saying that they've met their goals, they decide to go further with the Korean War. So MacArthur wants to invade the North Koreans, and now the goal is to have a unified democratic Korea. He bragged, which if you're a military leader or a leader, don't ever do this, they're going to have the troops home by Christmas. And so the United Nations approved this invasion to form a unified democratic Korea. The Soviet Union, by the way, withheld their vote. They refused to vote in Security Council on all these measures. And so they take the North Korean capital of Pyongyang on October 19th. And they were pushing up towards the Yalu River, which is the border of China and Korea. And it looked like it was going to work. And then there was massive amounts of Chinese troops gathering on the North Korean border. And there was warnings to Douglas MacArthur that the Chinese are amassing a huge military force, that they basically think the United States is on the move and they're trying to invade China. MacArthur ignores these warnings, ignores this intelligence that the Chinese are there. And they basically were warning the United States, you're getting too close to us, we're going to have to attack. And so the U.S. got a warning from China. It was ignored. On November 26, thousands and thousands of Chinese soldiers pour into Korea, capturing the Americans off guard. And so suddenly this little engagement to liberate South Korea is now the United States versus the most populated nation in the world. It's the U.S. versus the Chinese. Because of their overwhelmed, they were pushed back across the 38th parallel. There was bitter fighting, some of the worst fighting in the history of the Marine Corps at the Chosin Reservoir. Bitter cold and snow and blizzards set in because they were supposed to be home by winter, so they weren't issued winter gear. And they fought their way out, completely surrounded, very similar to the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. Very heroic fighting, being completely surrounded 360 degrees by Chinese soldiers and refusing to surrender. The communists recapture the city of Seoul. And so the UN troops stop their retreat by January 1951. They launch a counterattack, they retake Seoul, and then at that point the war becomes a stalemate along the 38th parallel. And so it's just neither side can gain an advantage. The US, they could overpower the North Koreans, but the Chinese were a massive military, a massive army. Truman doesn't like how MacArthur's handling the war. MacArthur sees this as an excuse to liberate China. He wants to launch an invasion of mainland China from Taiwan, and he will not rule out the use of atomic weapons. So this little engagement that was supposed to liberate South Korea from the North Koreans is now turning into World War III. With the possibility of nuclear weapons being used, you have the Soviet Union, who may or may not be involved. They have nuclear weapons all over a tiny little peninsula in Asia. And so MacArthur wants to attack China. He's possibly using nukes. And because of this, President Truman does something very bold. He fires Douglas MacArthur on April 11, 1951. He flies to Guam. MacArthur meets him in Guam, meets him in a car, and relieves him of his duties. Very controversial. The public didn't know about MacArthur's plans. They didn't know what he really wanted to do, and they were upset about Truman. In fact, when Truman leaves office in 1953, he has the lowest approval rating in the history of modern presidents. Around 27% of Americans approved of President Truman. As time has gone by and historians and more stories have come out about what Truman did, about MacArthur's plans, people now see that Truman did the right thing. In fact, Truman is usually regarded as one of the top 2, 3, 4 best presidents of the entire 20th century because of his handling of this and the Cold War. The public hated it. MacArthur, he came home and was given parades. He spoke before Congress. He talked about running for president. He had not been back to the United States since the 30s, since the Bonus Army fiasco. He gave a very sappy speech in which he said, "Old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like an old soldier, I'll fade away." And that's what he did. He faded away. The public kind of learned about it. Negotiations to begin the end of war, began in 1951, and they stalled. By the way, that's a big corncob pipe, not a growth on MacArthur's face. So you have MacArthur here at the Inchon invasion. You have some pictures from the Chosin Reservoir, and then this is just an animation. The red is the communist forces. Is how far they took. The green are the American United Nations forces, and it progresses through time. So basically you get stalemate along the war. We'll start this over here for you. You can watch it again. So you have the initial invasion of North Korea. They take everything except for the southern tip of Busan. You have the Incheon landing. They then push to here to the Yalu River. Now the Chinese pour in. The American United Nations forces push back. And there's a stalemate along the 38th parallel until 1953, which is in our next chapter with a new president, with President Eisenhower. This is Truman taking the heat for his handling of the Korean War. John Q. Public's really upset about what he did to Douglas MacArthur. This is the PBS 1-minute video on Truman. Check it out on YouTube if you want to see that. And that's all I have. If you have any questions, let me know, and I hope you learned something.